When we're communicating via the spoken word to an audience, whether that's an audience of one in person or an audience of many online, we are not simply communicating through the words we speak alone, what's called the semantic meaning. So if I say the word cat or owl to you, the semantic meaning that you derive from that is an owl and a pussycat. But of course, I'm communicating through other channels as well. You're reading meaning into the books on the shelf behind me. You're reading meaning into what I'm wearing, a scruffy old anorak today. You're reading meaning into my facial expressions, whatever they happen to be. And yes, you're reading meaning into the tone of my voice. And that's what I want to talk about in this episode, tone of voice. A lot of people have said to me they're worried about striking the wrong tone in these really, really troubled times. Clearly, we don't want to be too upbeat, too leery, too in people's faces, because that doesn't seem to be in keeping with the tone, the somber tone of the times. But nor do people want to be unnecessarily gloomy, because without any hope, of course, life would be even more miserable. So striking the right tone is important so that we don't distract from the words that we're trying to communicate, the message that we're trying to communicate. If I had £1 for every time somebody said to me, it's not what you say, it's the way that you say it counts, I'd be very, very wealthy right now. There's an awful lot of confusion around verbal and non-verbal communication. And a lot of that confusion can be traced back to a fellow called Professor Albert Mehrabian, who was studying face-to-face human communication at UCLA in the 1970s. And his experiments, he said, showed that 55% of human communication was non-verbal, that 38% was paraverbal, to do with things like tone and the volume of that communication, and only 7% was down to the meaning of the words themselves, that semantic meaning, all adding up to 100%. Now, his work was extrapolated wrongly into all sorts of areas that his experiments didn't cover. It's certainly the case that when there is tension between the transmitter of information and the receivers of that information in the audience, when there's tension, when there's dislike, when there's hatred, when there's animosity, for example, we do in the audience tend to fall back on things like tone to ascertain whether we trust the message that the person is communicating through the words. But in the workplace, in most circumstances where thankfully there isn't that animosity, I would hazard a guess that the words account for a much, much bigger part of the communication than those experiments from back in the 1970s. All of that said, of course tone is important, and never more so than right now. So here are some tips about how to strike the right tone in your presentations. So number one, put yourself in the shoes of the audience. How are they going to hear tonally what you're saying to them? It's called empathy. Tip number two, rehearse your presentation in front of a critical friend and ask them in particular to listen out to the tonal component of that presentation. They'll tell you soon enough whether you've struck the right chord, whether you've got it pitch perfect, or whether frankly you've been crass and you're getting the tone completely wrong. Number three, be aware of what's going on in the wider world. And I don't mean by that that you have to watch the news every single night, because it can be really depressing. But I mean, what's going on in the wider business world of the people that you're trying to communicate with. 4, write down a few words that, if you like, illustrate, represent the tone or point that you're trying to make. So write down the word determined, and indeed use the word determined if you want your presentation to sound steely and determined tonally. You'll find that your tone then mirrors the words that you've used, that you've written down on your notes. And then finally, point number 5, really don't overthink this. We instinctively get tone right when we're in the same space as a human being. Why? Well, because if we get the tone wrong, ultimately they'll bang us on the nose. They'll punch us, won't they, for insulting them. So don't overthink it. Trust your instinct, but give your instinct every chance of getting it right by following the preceding 4 steps.